بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. Last week we spoke about the Oslo Accords that were signed between the head of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat, and Yitzhak Rabin, the Prime Minister of Israel. And these accords were signed in Washington, D.C. in 1993 under the supervision of then U.S. President Bill Clinton. And the terms of these accords were really shameful. And Yasser Arafat, as the head of the PLO, agreeing to these terms was really a disgrace. So, from the terms of these accords, Israel granted the PLO limited self-rule only in Gaza and the city of Ariha, the city of Jericho. So that area consists of just about 2% of historic Palestine. So Yasser Arafat agreed to those terms. Okay, we'll take that. And we'll give you the rest. So the PLO agreeing to these terms and Yasser Arafat signing these accords, it was rejected worldwide by Muslim ulama. The ulama of the Muslims in different countries all over the world, they gave fatwas against the signing of these accords for many reasons. And one reason was that it halted jihad, that these accords called for the end of jihad, that the Muslims, they would not fight for Palestine anymore and they would give up their rights to Palestine. How can a Muslim agree to something like this? Right? It halted jihad. And many scholars issued fatwas against Yasser Arafat signing these accords. Amongst those ulama, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, Muhammad al-Ghazali, Mustafa Mashhur, all the way to India, Abu al-Hasan al-Nadwi, right? All of these ulama, they agreed that the signing of these accords was something that was haram and not permissible, because it's not permissible for the Muslims to give any concession on the land of Palestine. So according to the terms of these accords, Israel was given permanently 78% of the Palestinian land. Palestine was given 2%. Israel was given 78%, and as for the remaining 20%, it included Jerusalem, it included the settlements, different settlements where Israelis had taken over lands and claimed it as their own. It was said in the accords that these settlements and also the city of Jerusalem will be discussed at a later time. We're not going to deal with that right now. But for now, Israel gets 78%, and the Palestine Authority gets 2%, just Gaza and Ariha. And the remainder will be discussed at a later time, including Jerusalem. And even though they claim that they're giving Gaza and Ariha, Jericho, to Palestine, the rule that they agreed to allow Palestine to have was limited. It's not like they gave them complete independence. They said that, okay, you can have these lands, but you do not have border control, you are not allowed to form an army, and you are not allowed to have legislative independence. And Israel can veto any laws that you make at any time. Right? So what kind of independence is this? Right? So it was really a disgrace that the PLO agreed to these terms and signed these accords. It really made the PLO basically a subcontractor of the Zionist occupation, right? So while the PLO and Yasser Arafat were surrendering to Israel in this way, A man named Imad Aql, rahmatullahi alayh, who was one of the most prominent leaders and symbols of Hamas at that time, he was martyred in a military operation. American intelligence, the CIA, had discovered his location and they shared that location with Israel. So on November 24th, 1993, just a couple of months after the signing of the Oslo Accords in Washington, right? Israel surrounded the place where Imad Aql was. They surrounded the building that he was in with 60 armored vehicles to get one man. Look at the cowardice of these people. They brought 60 tanks to take out one guy, right? They brought 60 armored vehicles, but he still refused to surrender, subhanAllah. Even after being surrounded like that, he refused to surrender. He took up his weapon and he fought from the rooftop until he was hit by an Israeli anti-armor shell. That's a projectile that is used to blow up tanks. They shot him in the head with a shell that is used to blow up tanks. They shot him in the head with this, subhanAllah, and it tore through him and he was martyred, rahmatullahi alayh. And when he was buried, those who washed his body, they said, we found 70 bullets in his body, along with several stab wounds from knives. How are there stab wounds from knives if they hit him from far off? These stab wounds from the knives were inflicted upon his body after his death. They killed him, then they went to his body and they stabbed his dead body. Look at the barbarism of these people. Not only that, after they killed him, the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, he publicly announced celebrations for the killing of Imad Aql. He announced public celebrations for this. Right? Look at the disgusting nature of these people. So of course Hamas was very upset and very angry with this, and they responded. They responded with an operation. And they named that operation the Imad Aql operation. They named it after him. Just 2 weeks later, 2 weeks after his assassination. And in that operation, they were able to kill a high-ranking colonel in the Israeli army, a colonel by the name of Meir Mintz. And the Israeli newspaper Mariv, it described him after he was killed, after his colonel was killed, they eulogized him in the newspaper and they described him as the heart and the thinking mind of the war against terrorism and a symbol of the Israeli army in its fight against the intifada. Right? So Hamas killed one of Israel's high-ranking soldiers, this colonel. So the Hamas operations increased, and also Hezbollah in Lebanon, their operations against Israel, they increased. And the US tried to exert pressure on the Arab states to sign peace agreements with Israel. They started putting pressure on Jordan, on Syria, the different Arab states to sign peace agreements with Israel. So they invited Syria to a meeting. The US, they brokered a meeting between Syria and Israel. And this meeting took place on January 16th, 1994, between President Hafez al-Assad of Syria and the President of the United States, Bill Clinton, in Geneva. That's where this meeting took place. So Hafez al-Assad, he agreed to establish limited peace relations with Israel under the condition that Israel should withdraw from Hadbatul Jawlan, the Jawlan Heights, right, which Israel had occupied. It's part of Syria, but Israel had occupied that land. So Hafez al-Assad said, okay, I'm willing to establish limited peace relations with Israel, but they have to withdraw from Jawlan. So Yitzhak Rabin, he presented a phased peace plan, a peace plan that was to be implemented step by step in stages. So he said, okay, Israel would withdraw partially from Jawlan, not completely, but they will withdraw partially from Jawlan, and then after some more negotiations and further agreements, we will withdraw more. And then after some more negotiations and further agreements, we will withdraw more. And so, this will continue going in such a way until theoretically we will completely withdraw from Jawlan. But they refused to withdraw all at once. Yitzhak Rabin said, no, we're not going to withdraw all at once. And Syria insisted on a full withdrawal. So because of that, both sides could not come to an agreement, and this peace process between Syria and Israel, it collapsed. Now, about a month after this, on February 25th, 1994, a huge incident took place. February 25th, 1994, and that corresponds to the 15th of Ramadan in the Hijri year 1414. A Jewish settler named Baruch Goldstein, who was actually an American born in New York, who later on in the 1980s he settled in Israel. So on February 25th, 1994, which corresponds to Ramadan 15th, 1414, this man, Baruch Goldstein, he stormed Al-Masjid Al-Ibrahimi, the Ibrahimi Masjid in Khalil, in Hebron, during the Fajr prayer on that Ramadan morning. So he entered this masjid, Al-Masjid Al-Ibrahimi, and he opened fire while the people were praying Salat al-Fajr. He started massacring the Muslims who were praying Salat al-Fajr in Al-Masjid Al-Ibrahimi in the city of Khalil, the city of Hebron. And he killed 29 worshippers, 29 of the Musallin. And that included some children as well who were praying in the masjid. And he injured over 100 more as well. So he killed 29 and he injured more than 100. But alhamdulillah, the Muslims in the masjid who survived, they were able to jump him and overpower him, and alhamdulillah, they beat him to death. They beat him to death at that same time. La'natullahi alayhi. Right? So he was killed in this way. So after he was killed, the Jews, they started hailing him as a great martyr. And the Jewish extremist movements praised this man, and they supported the massacre of the Muslims that took place in that masjid. So in response to this, Hamas carried out 6 massive consecutive operations, one after another, against the occupation. And these operations were organized by a very well-respected commander who was known as Al-Muhandis. This was his nickname, Al-Muhandis, the engineer. His name was Yahya Ayyash, right? But he was known by his nickname Al-Muhandis because he was an expert in making explosive devices, right? So Yahya Ayyash Al-Muhandis, he organized these operations after the Ibrahimi Mosque massacre, and fighting ignited between both sides, right? Between Hamas and between the Zionist occupation. And Israel killed civilians while Hamas was targeting soldiers. But there were civilians that were killed as well on both sides. So Hamas then offered Israel a deal. Hamas said, look, you stop killing our civilians, we will stop killing yours. But Israel rejected this offer and they continued their harsh repression. And under this severe crackdown, Hamas actually reduced some of its operations in order to reorganize its ranks. And as we mentioned last week, Israel had arrested much of the senior leadership of Hamas. You know, there were tiers of leadership in Hamas, the first tier and second tier and third tier. So they arrested all of the first tier and the second tier and the third tier, right? All the way up to the 6th tier. So it was the 7th tier of leadership of Hamas that was leading them at that time. So of course, you know, things weren't as organized as they wanted them to be. So they had to reduce some of their operations at that point and reorganize their ranks. Now, while this was all going on, the PLO, Yasser Arafat, and his organization were calling upon the Palestinian people to stop the intifada, end the intifada. And the PLO promised to guarantee the rights of the Palestinians and the economy of the Palestinian. We're going to help you guys economically, right? But just stop the military operations. So under combined military pressure and also political pressure, in May of 1994, the first Intifada came to a halt after more than 79 months of resistance. Now by this time, right, it had been going on for years, right? From 1987, right, all the way to 1994, right? So almost 7 years. So during this time period of this Intifada, almost 1,400 Palestinians were martyred, including over 300 children, right? Over 130,000 were wounded, over 160,000 were arrested, right? But also the Intifada, it did achieve results, right? It created a widespread conviction amongst the people that a solution must be found for Palestine, and this occupation cannot continue as it is continuing. There must be a solution that has to be found. And it also increased global sympathy for the Palestinian people and their just cause, because what was going on was televised, and anyone who has a heart and they see the brutal repression of the Israeli regime upon the Palestinians, they will feel for the Palestinians. So it did increase global sympathy for the Palestinian people and their cause. And it also exposed the falsehood of Israeli quote-unquote democracy, and it exposed the repressive and harsh practices of the Israeli government. And it also humanized the identity of the Palestinian people, fueling their push for true independence. And also, it helped to separate Palestinian society and the Palestinian economy from Israeli institutions, right? Building an alternative Palestinian economy. And this really hurt Israel economically. It caused a lot of economic losses for Israel, right? So, alhamdulillah, there were some fruits of this Intifada, and one of the most important fruits is that it really produced a courageous generation who was ready to fight for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in order to liberate the holy land of Palestine. Now, as we mentioned, based on the terms of the Oslo Accords, Palestinian was given quote-unquote some independent land, right? But that independence was not true independence, as we mentioned, right? So they were given, as we mentioned, Gaza and Ariha. They were given Gaza and Ariha. So on May 13th, 1994, the Palestinian Authority, that was the name of the Palestinian state that they were establishing in Gaza and Ariha. It was called the PA, or the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority on May 13th, 1994, it was established in Ariha, in Jericho. And on May 18th, 1994, it was established in Gaza. So the Palestinian Authority was officially established in Jericho and Gaza in May of 1994. And Yasser Arafat was the head of it, right? So he formed the Palestinian Authority government before even entering Palestine. Like this guy was scared for his own life, right? So before even entering Palestine, he organized a police force of 30,000 officers. They're not allowed to have a military, but he was allowed to have a police force. So he organized a police force of 30,000 officers divided into 8 separate security agencies. Not one system, but 8 security systems to protect himself and to protect his organization, the PLO. And in July 1994, finally, Yasser Arafat personally entered Gaza. So the Palestinian Authority in Gaza was formed in May of 1994. But Yasser Arafat, he didn't want to enter until, he made sure that he had his security in place. So 2 months later, in July of 1994, Yasser Arafat entered Gaza, and he entered to a huge reception, and he officially assumed the role of the president of the Palestinian Authority. That same month, on July 25th, 1994, King Hussein of Jordan and Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli Prime Minister, they signed in Washington, D.C., the Washington Declaration to end the state of war between Jordan and Israel. Before this, Jordan and Israel officially were at war, right? So the Washington Declaration, signed on July 25th, 1994, officially ended the state of war between Jordan and Israel, and a final peace treaty, with more laid out conditions, was to be signed later on in Jordan. So Yasser Arafat, he began running the Palestinian Authority. Now he's the president of the Palestinian Authority. And one of his first acts on August 14th, 1994, one of the first things that he did was he launched a wide-scale arrest campaign targeting Hamas and also Islamic Jihad and all of the opposition groups against the peace process. All of those groups that opposed the peace process and the recognition of Israel, he cracked down on them and he started arresting them. So now the conflict kind of shifted from a Palestinian against Israeli struggle for the first time to a Palestinian against Palestinian struggle. Now the Palestinians are fighting against each other. And the cause of this division was this ill-fated peace process, quote-unquote peace process, that was engineered by America. It was engineered by the United States, right? On October 26, 1994, the Wadi Araba Treaty was signed in Jordan. Remember, the Washington Declaration was signed between King Hussein and Yitzhak Rabin a few months earlier, and they said they're going to finalize the treaty later on in Jordan. So they did that on October 26, 1994, in Wadi Araba in Jordan. So the treaty was signed in Jordan, and this was a permanent peace agreement between Jordan and Israel. So Jordan gained rights to water, to U.S. support for its economy. The U.S. promised, okay, we're going to support the Jordanian economy, but you just have to sign this treaty, right? And they were also given a central role in regional affairs. And as we mentioned, the Oslo Accords, the peace agreement between Israel and Yasser Arafat, gave him only Gaza and Ariha, only Gaza and Jericho. And as we mentioned, that's only 2% of historical Palestine. But they promised further phases. That was just phase one, but they promised further phases. And the final phase was supposedly going to settle all of the outstanding issues, including Jerusalem. What's going to happen to Jerusalem? What's going to happen to the settlements, right? All of that was supposed to be discussed at a later date, and there was supposed to be a final phase of the agreement that would provide solution to these problems, right? But Israel, they refused to discuss Jerusalem. They said they didn't want to discuss Jerusalem at all. They kept saying, this will be discussed later. We'll talk about Jerusalem later. And it's very clear they never intended to concede on Jerusalem, and they never intended to even discuss Jerusalem, right? All right, now the response of the Islamic movements came just a few days later after the signing of the treaty in Jordan at Wadi Araba. Just 3 days later, there was an operation in Tel Aviv that killed 22 Israelis and wounded 47. And this was a crushing blow to the quote-unquote peace process, right? They had thought that this peace process will eliminate the jihad operations, but instead, the jihad operations increased. After this peace process started, the military operations against the Zionist occupation increased, right? And these operations continued. And the Palestinian Authority under Yasser Arafat, they were the ones who were trying to suppress these movements. And they actually fought against each other, right? Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian Authority were fighting against the Islamic Jihad movements within Palestine. Palestinians are killing Palestinians now. They're killing each other, right? The Palestinian Authority killed 13 Palestinian demonstrators and arrested 300. So now Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the other resistance groups found that their main problem was no longer Israel. That's still a problem, but now it's not their main problem in their face now. The main problem now is the Palestinian Authority under Yasser Arafat. That's their main problem now. Because they are determined to crush jihad and to stop armed resistance, and they're determined to enforce this so-called peace process. Now, meanwhile, the peace steps between Jordan and Israel continued, and on December 7th, 1994, towards the end of 1994, on December 7th, 1994, Jordan opened an embassy, or Jordanian embassy in Israel. Jordan actually opened an embassy in Israel, and Israel opened an embassy in Jordan as well, right? But Hamas and Islamic Jihad, they continued their operations, and Israel expanded its repression beyond Palestine. They started hunting fighters worldwide. You know, any Hamas commanders that were in other countries and stuff, they started going and sending their spies over there and hunting them down in other countries as well. On October 26, 1995, the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence, they assassinated Dr. Fathi Shiqaqi, who was the leader of the Islamic Jihad movement. And this was not inside Palestine. This assassination took place in Malta. Right, so look, they're sending their people, they're sending their agents to different countries to take out leaders of the resistance. Right, so, but still, even with all of this, the movements, the resistance movements, they continued, and these operations continued. Then a new shock came. A big incident happened again. On November 4th, 1995, a Jewish extremist named Yigal Amir, he assassinated the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin during a large rally that was taking place. So Yitzhak Rabin, the Prime Minister of Israel, was assassinated by a fellow Jew, an extremist Jew, this man Yigal Amir. And it was a protest against the peace treaty. So there were extremist Jews who did not want peace either. They wanted to kill all of the Palestinians, and they thought that Yitzhak Rabin agreeing to peace with the Palestinians was wrong. So this man, Yigal Amir, he was able to get to the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, and he actually successfully assassinated him. So now the world is surprised. Look, now Jews are killing Jews. They're killing their own people, right? So this was a huge incident. And Yitzhak Rabin was given a grand funeral in Israel, a sitting prime minister, assassinated in Israel. He was given a grand funeral, and it was attended by leaders of different countries around the world, and it was also attended by Arab delegations that came from the Arab countries. And Yasser Arafat himself, he recited Surah Al-Fatiha at the funeral of Yitzhak Rabin. Wal-'iyadhu billah. Look at these people, sellouts. On December 18th, 1995, a dialogue was held between Hamas, led by Khalid Mish'al. Hafidhahullah, he's still alive, Khalid Mish'al. He was the representative of Hamas, and he had a meeting with the representative of the Palestinian Authority, a man named Salim Za'noun. So this man, Salim al-Za'noun, the representative of the PA, he tried to persuade Khalid Mish'al to abandon jihad and to participate in the upcoming elections organized by the Palestinian Authority. But Hamas refused to stop its operations, and the Palestinian Authority, rejected the conditions of Hamas. So matters remained unresolved. Then Hamas escalated its operations, and Islamic Jihad also escalated their operations, and Yasser Arafat was unable to control them. He tried to arrest so many of them and crack down on them, but he was unable to control these movements. So because of these increased operations, and because of the jihad movement continuing, Israel in 1996, they announced the suspension of the peace process. We're not going to move forward with the peace process, right? They announced in 1996 the suspension of the peace process, and they began 1996 with the assassination of one of the main figures of the resistance, Yahya Ayyash al-Muhandis. Right? He was targeted in an assassination by the Zionist occupation. How did they kill him? How were they able to get to him? They killed him by rigging his cell phone with explosives. And how did they get to his cell phone? How were they able to rig his cell phone? An associate of Yahya Ayyash, a so-called friend of his, someone he thought was his associated friend, a man named Kamal Hamad, he collaborated with Israel. He was a traitor. He collaborated with Israel, and they gave him this rigged phone to give to Yahya Ayyash. Right? So they were able to monitor this device. They were able to spy on his conversations as well. And he became suspicious at one point that his conversations were being eavesdropped upon, Yahya Ayyash. So he was talking to his father one day on the cell phone, and he said in the and remember, the Israeli forces, they're listening to all of these conversations because the cell phone is rigged. So Yahya Ayyash, he felt uncomfortable. He felt that there's something with this phone. So while he was speaking to his father, he told his father, "Don't call me on this phone again." And they heard that. So they realized, okay, he's on to them. So immediately, they detonated the phone. Immediately, when they heard him say that to his father, they detonated the phone remotely, and it blew up the head of Yahya Ayyash. And that is how they targeted him, and that's how they assassinated him. And this so-called associate of his betrayed him and worked with the Israeli intelligence in order to carry out this assassination. And for this khiyana, for this betrayal, Kamal Hamad, he was rewarded by the Israeli government with $1 million and Israeli protection. Right? Okay, he can have that in this world, but he will pay for the consequences of his betrayal. وَلَا تَحْسَبَنَّ اللَّهَ غَافِلًا عَمَّا يَعْمَلُ الظَّالِمُونَ. Do not think that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is unaware of what the evildoers do. So Yahya Ayyash was one of the main figures of the resistance against the Zionist occupation. He was assassinated in this way. And his funeral was attended by 250,000 Palestinians. Huge funeral. Attended by 250 Palestinians from all factions. And Yasser Arafat himself offered condolences. Not that it matters, but he gave his condolences as well. Right? So these were the tactics, right? The underhanded tactics that the Zionist occupation used and that they continue to use even today. So of course Hamas retaliated against this. The following month, on February 25th, 1996, there was a huge operation that they called the Yahya Ayyash operation, named after Yahya Ayyash. So they blew up a bus and they killed 24 Israelis and they wounded 50. And then there was another operation that took place in Asqalan where they killed 35 Israeli soldiers. And then further operations followed, killing 64 Israelis. So Israeli responded with very harsh repression against the Palestinians, right? And Arafat's Palestinian Authority joined in with the Israelis. They helped the Israelis and they launched major arrest campaigns against the Islamic resistance movements. And they imprisoned a large number of these fighters, right? But still, these operations continue to go on and they continue to multiply. And this drove Israel to desperation. They became desperate. So they cried out to the world for support. Help us. In April 1996, there was a global conference that was held in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And it was attended by Arab states and Gulf states and major powers and also the PLO and Israel to find a solution to these operations that continued against the occupying Zionist regime. And now, by this point, America was the main player in all of this, right? Before this, and we talked about this in previous lessons, Britain had played this role earlier on in the 20th century. In the early 1900s, it was Britain that was behind everything that was going on, right? They were the ones who were responsible for the creation of Israel, right? So the British, they were behind all of these events in the early part of the 20th century, the early 1900s. But then around the second half of the 20th century, things shifted and America became the main player. This deceitful role that Britain had played for so long, now it shifted to the United States. Now, the United States was the main supporter of Israel, and to this day, they remain the main and biggest supporter of Israel. They provided with weapons, with training, with billions and billions of dollars, right? The United States is the main player in this game. So, in Lebanon, during the same time period, there were operations that were being carried out by Hezbollah against Israel. They were carrying out hundreds of operations per month against the Israeli military. So Israel was having a hard time dealing with all of this, and it announced an operation, a military operation of its own that was known as Operation Grapes of Wrath. Operation Grapes of Wrath, where they launched air and naval assaults upon Hezbollah. But of course, they avoided a ground offensive. This was always the way of Israel. They never liked to do ground offensive. They always like to do it, by the air. Or they like to do it now in the modern days. They like to do it with drones, right? They don't like face-to-face confrontation because of their cowardly nature, right? As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about these people, لا يقاتلونكم جميعا إلا في قرى محصنة أو من وراء جدور. That they're not going to fight you. They're not all going to come and fight you face to face, except from behind the walls of a fortress. They will do it from a fortress, or they will do it from behind walls, but they don't want to go face to face with you. And this is due to the cowardly nature that they had at that time and that they continue to have today. They fear direct confrontation, right? And their way was to attack civilians and infrastructure and power stations, right? So in April of 1996, there was the Qana massacre in southern Lebanon, where Israel shelled a shelter full of civilians, elderly people, women, children, and they killed 100 of them inside. And they intentionally did this. And the public opinion of the world at that time, it erupted against Israel. Like, how can they intentionally target civilians in a shelter? And the media was showing images of the dead children, dead women, dead elderly spread across the massacre site. Right? So world opinion started going against Israel at that time. That was April of 1996. But Israel declared that it would continue striking civilians in Lebanon unless Hezbollah stopped attacking Israel and its soldiers. So Hezbollah responded. They said, we're ready to stop targeting civilians if you stop targeting civilians. But we will not stop striking your soldiers. They said, we will continue to strike your soldiers, but if you stop striking our civilians, then we will make sure we don't strike any of your civilians as well. Now, in the meantime, while all of this was going on, in March and April of 1996, the Palestinian Authority under Yasser Arafat arrested more than 1,000 activists from Hamas and from Islamic Jihad. And they closed schools, they closed charitable associations, they closed zakat committees, they closed orphanages that were affiliated with Hamas and Islamic Jihad. So look, the Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian Authority, they're hurting their own people, closing schools, closing charities, closing orphan houses. What are you doing? But this is what they did. And Israel praised Yasser Arafat. If Israel is praising you, you know you're doing something wrong. But Israel praised Yasser Arafat and his actions. And finally, the Palestinian Authority went even further than that. It abolished all of the articles of the Palestinian National Charter that had been formed years earlier. And from the articles of the Palestinian National Charter was that Palestinians reject the recognition of Israel. That Israel does not have the right to exist. Right? That the land is all Palestinian land. These were from the articles of the Palestinian National Charter. So now the Palestinian Authority, they abolished all of those articles that rejected the recognition of Israel. Anything that rejects the recognition of Israel, they removed it from the Palestinian National Charter. Right? So they officially and openly recognized Israel and they gave Israel the right to remain permanently on Palestinian land. These were the actions of the PLO and Yasser Arafat under the Palestinian Authority. So it was really a great betrayal. And this took place in 1996. So inshallah we'll stop there for today bi'idhnillah, and inshallah next week we'll continue with more on the history of the Holy Land bi'idhnillah. Jazakumullahu khayra wa barakallahu feekum wallahu alam wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. عليكم السلام. الحمد لله.